Elias Marin didn't notice the change all at once. It began quietly, almost politely, the way fog moves in from the sea without asking permission. He had moved to Lisbon months earlier for reasons that no longer felt important: cheaper rent, fewer expectations, a sense that his old routines had grown too loud. His days were simple: morning walks along narrow streets, freelance work at a small desk by the window, evenings spent watching light fade over tiled rooftops. Nothing dramatic, nothing mystical. And yet, something kept repeating, not events exactly, but thoughts. The same internal sentences would arrive at the same moments, as if on a schedule. When he woke, there was a tightness in his chest and the thought, "You're already behind." When he worked, another voice followed close behind, "This won't matter anyway." At night, just before sleep, the same dull fear surfaced, unnamed but familiar. He had always assumed this was normal: stress, conditioning, habit. But repetition has a way of revealing itself once you start paying attention. The dreams were harder to ignore. Elias found himself standing in places that felt staged rather than imagined. Long corridors with no doors, vast rooms lit from nowhere, figures moving at the edge of his vision but never approaching. The most unsettling part wasn't the imagery. It was the sensation of being observed, not by something external, but by the dream itself, as if it were waiting for him to respond correctly. Each time he woke, the same phrase lingered without words. "You missed it again." One afternoon, escaping a sudden downpour, Elias ducked into a small second-hand bookstore tucked between a bakery and a closed tailor's shop. The air inside smelled of paper and dust and something older. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just shelter. That was when he noticed the book. No title on the spine. No author. Its cover was plain, worn smooth by time or hands. When he opened it, the pages were filled with dense, looping handwriting, interspersed with symbols that felt more like instructions than illustrations. He bought it without thinking. At home, the book refused to behave like normal reading material. Elias would open to one page and find himself thinking about another. He'd reread the same paragraph 3 times and realize he wasn't absorbing the words, only the feeling behind them. The text didn't explain ideas so much as point toward them. One line, written in the margin, stopped him cold: "They do not silence you. They keep you busy." That night, instead of falling into his usual pre-sleep spiral, Elias tried something different. When the familiar fear arose, he didn't argue with it. He didn't soothe it or analyze it. He simply noticed it. The effect was immediate and unsettling. The fear didn't disappear, but it lost its authority. It felt like background noise instead of a command. Over the following days, Elias began to see patterns everywhere. Not mystical signs, not omens, patterns of reaction. A message that irritated him. A memory that triggered shame. A headline that sparked anger. Each response felt automatic, preloaded. The more he observed them, the clearer it became that these reactions weren't chosen. They were activated. He remembered another line from the book: "Reaction is consent mistaken for instinct." That realization unsettled him more than any supernatural explanation could have. If his emotional responses were not truly his, then what part of him was actually in control? Or more precisely, what part of him was being controlled? Elias didn't speak to anyone about this at first. Not because he feared being judged, but because the experience felt fragile, like something that could collapse under explanation. He started keeping notes instead. short observations scribbled in the margins of the book or on scraps of paper. Fear arrives after thought, not before. Distraction always follows clarity. The loop resets when I identify with the feeling. One evening, while rereading a section he had somehow skipped before, Elias noticed a name written repeatedly in different hands, as if added over time: Seraphine Voss. There was no context, no explanation, just a small note beside it. Not a teacher. A witness. Curiosity outweighed caution. After some searching, Elias discovered that Seraphine Voss lived just outside the city, in a quiet neighborhood near the old archives. She was known locally as an eccentric researcher, someone who helped restore forgotten texts but avoided public attention. Reaching out felt impulsive, but also inevitable. When they finally met, there was no dramatic greeting, no recognition scene. Seraphine simply listened as Elias described the loops, the dreams, the book. She didn't interrupt or nod knowingly. When he finished, she asked only one question. "When the thought appears," she said softly, "do you become it, or do you see it?" The simplicity of the question struck him harder than any explanation could have. Elias realized that the moments of relief he'd experienced all shared one thing in common: distance. Not suppression. Not resistance. Distance. Seraphine didn't offer answers that day. She only confirmed something Elias already suspected. What he was experiencing wasn't an awakening brought on by effort or belief. It was the result of a crack, a small but irreversible shift in how attention moved. Once you see the loop, you can't unsee it. Once you stop reacting automatically, something else begins to surface. As Elias left her workspace and stepped back into the city, the noise felt the same, but its grip had loosened. The thoughts still came. The pattern still tried to repeat. But now, between stimulus and response, there was space. And in that space, something waited. Elias didn't return home right away after meeting Seraphine. He walked without direction, letting the city move around him while his attention stayed inward. The sounds of traffic, footsteps, distant conversations blended into a single hum. Normally, this would have triggered irritation or fatigue. Instead, he noticed the absence of reaction first, and only afterward the sounds themselves. It felt unnatural, like standing slightly out of sync with the world. When he visited Seraphine again a few days later, she didn't greet him with questions. She placed a cup of tea on the table and waited. Elias spoke first, describing the strange calm that appeared when he simply noticed thoughts instead of following them. He admitted that part of him wanted to label it, explain it, turn it into progress. Another part felt wary, as if naming it would collapse it. Seraphine smiled faintly. "That impulse," she said, "is the system correcting itself." She explained nothing further at first. Instead, she asked Elias to recount a recent moment of emotional disturbance in detail. He described an email from a former client, polite on the surface, subtly dismissive beneath. His chest had tightened. His mind had rushed to self-defense, then self-criticism. The usual sequence. "And where were you," Seraphine asked, "when all of that happened?" "In my head," Elias replied automatically. She shook her head. "No. You were inside the reaction. There's a difference." She leaned back and finally spoke more plainly. What Elias had been sensing wasn't a personal flaw or psychological quirk. It was a mechanism, a pattern of engagement designed to keep awareness occupied. Fear wasn't the tool, she explained, but the byproduct. The real leverage came from identification, believing every thought that appeared was a voice worth answering. She referred to these mechanisms collectively as Archons, not as beings to fear, but as functions. Think of them as habits of perception, she said. They don't attack. They invite participation. Elias felt a strange relief hearing this. It stripped the experience of drama without diminishing its importance. If nothing was actively hunting him, then nothing needed to be fought. That realization alone loosened something in his chest. Seraphine slid the old book across the table. She opened it to a page Elias hadn't seen before, though he was certain it hadn't been there earlier. The text was brief. No symbols this time. Just one sentence. Recognition ends the transaction. "This is what you call the code?" Elias asked. Seraphine shook her head again. "It's not something you possess. It's something you do." She asked him to try an experiment. The next time a strong emotion arose, fear, anger, shame, he was not to change it, suppress it, or follow it. He was only to notice two things: the sensation itself and the thought claiming ownership of it. Nothing more. "The moment you see both," she said, "the loop weakens." Elias tested this almost immediately. On his way home, a memory surfaced unexpectedly, an old argument, words he wished he'd said differently. The familiar wave of regret followed. Instead of sinking into it, he paused internally and observed. There was the tightness in his stomach. There was the thought insisting, "This defines you." For a split second, something unusual happened. The thought felt optional, not false. Optional. The relief that followed wasn't emotional. It was structural. As if a load-bearing wall had been revealed as unnecessary. Over the following weeks, Elias practiced without ritual or schedule. He didn't meditate longer or read more. He simply noticed. The effects accumulated quietly. Emotional spikes shortened. Mental noise softened. Situations that once pulled him into automatic response now passed with less friction. What surprised him most was how the system adapted. On days when he was clear, distractions multiplied. Notifications, errands, sudden urges to reorganize his life or plan his future. Seraphine had warned him about this. "When reaction fails," she'd said, "noise increases." One evening, during a particularly deep moment of stillness, Elias felt something he could only describe as pressure, not on his body, but on his attention. Thoughts came faster, more persuasive. Old fears returned dressed as urgency. For the first time since this began, he felt tempted to resist. He remembered Seraphine's words, and did nothing. He didn't push back. He didn't engage. He watched. The pressure peaked and then collapsed, like a wave breaking without shore. In its place was a clarity, so neutral it almost felt disappointing. No visions. No revelations. Just a simple understanding. The system required his participation to function. Without it, there was nothing to maintain. When he told Seraphine about the experience, she nodded once. "That's why they can't stop you," she said. "There's nothing to stop when you don't move." Elias began to understand that awakening wasn't an event but a subtraction. Each time he failed to react, something fell away. Identity loosened. Narratives thinned. What remained wasn't emptiness, but presence, steady, observant, untroubled by the need to define itself. The code, if it could be called that, wasn't secret knowledge. It was a posture. A refusal to confuse awareness with content. And once adopted, it changed the terms of engagement permanently. The final shift didn't arrive with warning. There was no sense of buildup, no signal that something decisive was about to occur. Elias was sitting alone in his apartment, late afternoon light slanting across the floor, when the familiar pressure returned, stronger than before, but strangely hollow. Thoughts lined up with unusual coordination, each one sharp, persuasive, urgent. They spoke in his own voice, wearing his memories, his preferences, his doubts. The pull to engage was immediate. For the first time, the system didn't feel abstract. It felt intimate. A narrative unfolded rapidly. Questions about whether he was avoiding life, whether this calm was actually withdrawal, whether he was slowly detaching from responsibility rather than transcending it. Each thought demanded an answer. Each carried emotional weight. Elias noticed his body reacting before he could intervene, heart rate rising, breath tightening, shoulders bracing, and then something unexpected happened. He recognized the pattern not as an attack, but as an invitation. There was no anger in that recognition, no triumph, just clarity. The sensations were real. The thoughts were articulate. But the sense of ownership, the idea that these phenomena were him, failed to lock into place. He didn't step back dramatically. He simply didn't step in. The pressure intensified briefly, as if testing the boundary. Images from the past surfaced. Regrets, unfinished conversations, imagined futures filled with consequence. Normally, any one of these would have been enough to pull him into reaction. This time, they floated disconnected. Observed, Elias noticed something else then. The system didn't know how to proceed without resistance. There was no escalation, only repetition. The same thoughts returned in slightly altered forms, like a script searching for an emotional hook that wasn't there. When none appeared, the entire structure lost coherence. What followed wasn't silence, but spaciousness. He didn't feel enlightened. He didn't feel special. What he felt was unburdened, as if a constant internal negotiation had quietly ended. The mind still produced thoughts, but they no longer demanded agreement. Sensations still arose, but they didn't define the moment. Experience continued, unfiltered by the need to interpret it. Later, when Elias described this to Seraphine, she didn't congratulate him. She didn't label it a breakthrough. She simply listened and then said, "That's non-participation." She explained that most systems of control depend on opposition. Struggle feeds them as effectively as submission. What dissolves them is neutrality, not indifference, but clarity without attachment. The moment Elias stopped treating internal events as instructions, the transaction ended. "There's nothing to maintain now," she said. "No stance to hold. No state to preserve." This, Elias realized, was the permanent shift she'd hinted at before. Not permanence in experience, but permanence in orientation. Awareness no longer collapsed into content automatically. There was always space now, even during stress, even during uncertainty. The Archons, those functions of distraction and identification, had not been defeated. They had simply been rendered irrelevant. In the days that followed, life continued much as before. Elias still worked. He still walked the same streets. Conversations unfolded normally. But his relationship to experience had changed fundamentally. When frustration arose, it was noticed early and dissolved quickly. When fear appeared, it was seen as sensation plus story, nothing more. The loops no longer closed. There was a quiet confidence in this, not the confidence of belief, but of familiarity. Elias didn't need reminders or rituals. The code wasn't something he applied. It was something he refrained from abandoning. One evening, while returning the old book to the shelf, he noticed that its pages now seemed ordinary. The symbols no longer carried weight. The handwriting no longer pulled his attention inward. The book had served its purpose. It had pointed, not taught. Elias understood then that awakening was not an escape from the world, nor a transcendence of humanity. It was a release from misidentification, a return to something simpler and more stable than personality or narrative. Awareness, resting in itself, required no defense. The system hadn't collapsed dramatically. It had faded through disuse. And that was the final realization. Nothing had ever been holding him captive. He had only been participating in something that no longer needed his involvement. The moment that participation ended, so did its influence. If you stayed with this story until now, it's likely because something in it felt familiar, not as an idea, but as a memory. This isn't a tale about becoming someone new or accessing hidden power. It's about recognizing what has always been present beneath the noise. Awakening, as you've seen, doesn't arrive through force or effort. It appears when effort stops being mistaken for awareness. Stories like this aren't meant to convince. They're meant to reflect. You may have noticed moments in your own life where reactions softened, where thoughts lost their urgency, where clarity appeared without explanation. Those moments weren't accidents. They were glimpses of non-participation already at work. If this narrative resonated, take it as a reminder rather than a lesson. There's nothing here to adopt, believe in, or defend. Only something to notice, again and again, until noticing becomes effortless. If you found value in this story, consider supporting the channel by subscribing so you don't miss future reflections like this one. If the message helped clarify something for you, a like lets others find it more easily. And if you know someone who's been questioning the noise inside their own mind, sharing this video might offer them the same quiet recognition. Each interaction helps this space remain available for calm, grounded explorations like this. Thank you for listening, for observing, and for being here.